Well, we have exclusive new reporting in the case of a Michigan woman missing in the Bahamas for more than a week.
The ocean has a way of swallowing secrets, but usually, it takes more than 2 feet of water to do it. Imagine a sunset in the Bahamas. Crystal clear turquoise waves, the smell of salt air, and a couple, Brian and Lynette Hooker, leaving a seaside inn in a tiny 8-foot dinghy. They're heading back to their sailboat, anchored just 200 yards away. It's a trip that should take 5 minutes. But Lynette never makes it. According to Brian, a little blow of wind popped up, and Lynette simply bounced off the raft. He claims he watched his wife, a fit and seasoned sailor, get swept away into the dark Atlantic. But as the sun rose the next morning, the story he told investigators began to take on water faster than a sinking ship. He didn't call for help. He didn't fire his flares, at least, not when anyone could see them. Instead, Brian Hooker spent the next 9 hours rowing across the bay to a different island 4 miles away. His excuse? Lynette took the keys to the electric motor when she fell, leaving him stranded. But here is where the psychology of a liar meets the reality of forensics. That electric motor? It doesn't have a traditional key, it has a simple plastic clip that any sailor knows how to bypass in seconds. The rough seas. Locals anchored right next to them say the water was like glass that night. And that 9-hour rowing trip? Expert drift analysis shows that even a slow, unpowered float would have taken half that time. So, what was Brian really doing in those missing 6 hours? Today, we are deconstructing the mounting evidence against Brian Hooker. From the chilling surveillance photo taken just minutes before she vanished, showing a couple in the midst of a silent, bitter war, to the broken oar that suggests a much darker purpose than paddling. We'll look at the history of domestic threats, the dry bag that should have floated but vanished, and the suspicious flight Brian took back to the States while the community was still diving for his wife's body. There are only 2 options: either Lynette Hooker performed a vanishing act that defies the laws of physics, or she never went into the water at all. This isn't just a story about a missing person, it's a breakdown of the cracks in a fabricated alibi. Welcome to my channel. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications because we will be dropping a deeper dive into this case tomorrow, and we want you to be the first to see it when it drops. To understand how Lynette Hooker vanished, we have to look at the last time she was seen alive. It is 6:34 p.m. at the Abaco Inn, a picturesque spot where the tropical beauty of the Bahamas usually masks the tension of the people visiting it. The sun is beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pool deck, and in this setting, a single photograph was taken. This image is the final proof of life for Lynette, and for those trained in the nuances of forensic psychology and body language, it tells a story far more complex than a simple vacation snapshot. In high-retention storytelling, we often look for what is known as the isolation factor. In this photo, Lynette and Brian are alone, distanced from the other patrons. They have pulled away from the crowds, seeking a private space for what appears to be a heavy, high-stakes conversation. When you analyze Lynette's posture, the red flags are immediate. Her arms are tightly crossed over her chest, a universal gesture of self-protection and defensiveness. Her body is angled away from Brian, creating a physical barrier between them. She isn't just sitting, she is bracing. Brian, conversely, is leaning toward her with his head down. In many criminal cases involving domestic disputes, this specific cluster of body language, the leaning in versus the pulling away, suggests an imbalance of power or a desperate attempt by one party to control the narrative of a failing argument. The bartender at the inn provides the next crucial layer to this chapter. He remembers serving them 2 rounds of Cuba Libres. While alcohol is often a catalyst for tragedy, the bartender was clear on one specific point: neither of them appeared drunk. They were coherent, functioning, and capable of making decisions. This is a critical pivot in our investigation because it eliminates the drunken accident defense. If a tragedy occurred later that night, it wasn't because someone was too intoxicated to stand, it was occurring within the context of a calculated, sober environment. We also have to examine the history of this relationship. This wasn't a sudden flare-up of tension. 2 years prior, during a domestic dispute in Jackson, Brian allegedly choked Lynette and told her he would kill her and throw her overboard. When a man provides a verbal blueprint for a crime, and then 2 years later that exact scenario plays out, the concept of coincidence disappears. Lynette had reportedly tried to leave him multiple times before. In the world of true crime, the most dangerous timeframe for a victim is the moment they decide to leave for good. Was this final conversation at the Abaco in the moment she told him their marriage was finally over? As they walked down the dock to that 8-foot dinghy, Lynette was wearing a green cover-up over a black bikini. This detail seems minor until you look at Brian's subsequent statements to the police. He later claimed he didn't know what she was wearing. He forgot the cover-up. He forgot the specifics of her appearance that evening. This is a psychological phenomenon often seen in perpetrators known as selective amnesia. By stripping away the humanity of the victim and reducing them to a vague memory, the perpetrator creates a mental distance from the act they may have committed. They stepped into that small boat together, the electric motor hummed to life, and they disappeared into the twilight. Only one of them would ever be seen again, and the transition from that pool deck to the open water is where the silence begins. The environment itself is a character in this chapter. The waters around Elbow Cay are not the deep, dark abyss of the open Atlantic, they are shallow, often only a few feet deep, and remarkably clear. To bounce out of a boat in these conditions and vanish is statistically improbable. A fit woman like Lynette, who was a seasoned sailor and a strong swimmer, would not simply be swept away in a light breeze in water where she could likely stand up. Yet, Brian's story relies on the idea that the ocean is a monster that appeared for a few seconds just to take his wife and then vanished back into a calm night. As they drifted away from the lights of the Abaco Inn, the darkness of the bay became the perfect shroud for whatever transpired next. In the minutes following that 6:34 p.m. photo, the couple moved from a public space where their tension was visible to a private, silent arena where Brian was the only witness to Lynette's final moments. Witnesses on nearby boats reported that the weather that evening was normal, a typical sea breeze, but nothing that would cause a dinghy to toss its passengers. This contradicts Brian's later claims of a little blow that caused a violent movement. When the story of the survivor contradicts the testimony of the environment, we have to look at the motive for the lie. If Brian needed the weather to be rough, it was because he needed a reason for Lynette to be gone that didn't involve his own hands. The photo at the inn shows the psychological buildup, the walk to the boat shows the opportunity, and the transition into the shallow bay provides the location. Every second after they left that dock, Brian was creating a timeline that would eventually have a 9-hour hole in it. This chapter of their lives ended the moment the dinghy's motor was engaged. From that point on, Lynette was no longer a woman on vacation, she was a woman trapped in an 8-foot space with a man who had already threatened her life. The finality of that surveillance image stands as a haunting reminder that the most dangerous place for Lynette wasn't the ocean, it was the seat right next to her husband. As we move into the actual events of the disappearance, we have to remember the woman in the green cover-up, arms crossed, looking at a future she would never get to see. The tragedy of Lynette Hooker didn't start in the water, it started at 6:34 p.m. on a pool deck, captured in a frame that documented the end of her life before it actually happened. This is the black hole of the investigation, the 9-hour void between 7 p.m., when the couple left the dock at the Abaco Inn, and 4 a.m., when Brian finally signaled for help. In any true crime narrative, the timeline is the backbone of the case, but in the story of Lynette Hooker, the timeline isn't just a sequence of events, it is a series of impossible physics and psychological contradictions that defy every standard of maritime logic. Brian's official story is that as they were navigating back to their sailboat, a sudden blow of wind jerked the 8-foot dinghy. He claims this movement caused Lynette to simply bounce out of the raft and into the water. In high-retention storytelling, we look for the behavioral outlier, and Brian's reported reaction is the definition of one. According to his own statement, he watched his wife, the woman he called his soulmate, get swept away into the dark, and his response was to throw her one seat cushion. Not the life vests that were sitting right at his feet. Not the second seat cushion. Not the dry bag. Just one single piece of foam. Psychologically, this minimalist rescue attempt is a massive red flag. When someone you love is in mortal danger, the human instinct is overcorrection. You throw everything that floats, you scream, and you jump in. Brian did none of those things. The centerpiece of Brian's defense for why he didn't save her is the key lie. He told investigators that he couldn't use the electric motor to go back and get her because Lynette was holding the dry bag, and inside that bag were the keys to the engine. He claimed that without that key, he was forced to row by hand for 9 hours to find help. To a landlubber, this sounds like a tragic stroke of bad luck. To a sailor, it sounds like a fabrication. These small electric outboards don't use a traditional ignition key, they use a plastic kill switch clip. If that clip is removed, the engine stops as a safety measure. However, any Marine, which Brian is, knows that you can bypass this switch in 5 seconds with a piece of wood, a plastic card, or even by just holding the button down with your thumb. The idea that a trained Marine sat in a boat and watched his wife drown because he couldn't figure out how to start a simple electric motor is an insult to the intelligence of the investigators and the audience alike. So, if he wasn't rowing frantically to save his wife, what was he doing in those 9 hours? We have to look at the forensic artifacts left behind, specifically the broken oar. When Brian finally reached Marsh Harbor, a staggering 4 miles away from where he started, witnesses noticed one of his oars was snapped. You do not break a heavy-duty oar by simply rowing a tiny plastic boat in a calm bay. You break an oar when it strikes a solid object with immense force, or when it is used as a lever or a tool. Was the oar used as a weapon in a struggle? Or was it used to dig in the soft, sandy soil of one of the many remote Bahamian cays that dot the area? In true crime, a broken tool at the scene of a disappearance often suggests a task that was never supposed to be part of the official story. The physics of the current also betray the narrative. Search and rescue experts later conducted a drift analysis to see where a person would go if they fell in at that location. The results were damning. If Lynette had fallen where Brian claimed, the wind and current would have pushed her directly toward the shoreline of Elbow Cay, not out into the deep ocean. Furthermore, the water in that area is famously shallow. At the time of the disappearance, a man of Brian's height could have likely stood up in the very spot where he says Lynette vanished. The question remains, why didn't he jump in? A strong swimmer and a Marine could have easily reached a woman in such shallow, calm conditions. Instead, Brian created a massive geographic detour. He chose to row for miles across the open bay to Marsh Harbor rather than moving 200 yards to the nearest shore where lights were visible and help was immediate. This leads us to the time gap theory. Experts estimate that even if Brian had been forced to row the entire way, the trip to Marsh Harbor should have taken roughly 3 to 4 hours at most. This leaves a terrifying 5-hour gap where Brian was completely unaccounted for. In investigative circles, this is known as disposal time. This is the window where a perpetrator hides the evidence, cleans the scene, and mentally rehearses the grieving husband persona they are about to present to the world. During these missing hours, the bright yellow dry bag also disappeared. Brian claimed it went down with Lynette, but dry bags are designed to do exactly what their name implies, stay dry and float. If that bag contained their passports and the engine key, it would have been a neon beacon floating on the surface of the water. The Coast Guard found nothing. Not a bag, not a cushion, not a trace of Lynette. This lack of debris suggests that these items didn't fall into the water by accident, they were placed somewhere with intent. As the clock ticked toward 4 a.m., Brian finally made contact with a witness, claiming he was exhausted from his heroic 9-hour row. But the witnesses who saw him arrive didn't see a man in the throes of a life-and-death panic. They saw a man who was strangely monotone, almost robotic, delivering a story that felt scripted. He was performing shock rather than experiencing it. This 9-hour void wasn't a struggle against the elements, it was the construction of a lie. Every stroke of the oar was a calculated move to distance himself from the 6:34 p.m. version of himself and transform into the victim of a tragic maritime accident. By the time the sun rose over the Bahamas, scene had been set, the evidence had been buried, and the mystery of the 9-hour gap became the primary obstacle to finding the truth about what happened to Lynette Hooker. The hallmark of a guilty conscience isn't just what happens during the crime, it's what happens during the search. As the sun rose over the Bahamas the morning after Lynette vanished, the reality of the situation began to set in for the locals, the authorities, and the search teams. This was no longer a frantic rescue mission, it was becoming a forensic puzzle. While the U.S. Coast Guard moved in with sophisticated sonar, heat-sensing drones, and aircraft to fly a grid from Marsh Harbor back to the supposed fall point, the community of Elbow Cay mobilized. Dozens of private boats took to the water, manned by people who knew these tides and currents better than anyone. They were looking for a body, a bright yellow dry bag, or even the single seat cushion Brian claimed to have thrown. They found absolutely nothing. In the Bahamas, water is so crystalline that you can see a coin resting on the seabed at 20 feet. A human body, or even a buoyant dry bag designed to float, would have been a neon sign against the turquoise floor. The total absence of debris points to a chilling conclusion: Lynette Hooker likely never went into the water where Brian said she did. In true crime investigations, this is often the moment a missing person case shifts into a land-based recovery operation. If the ocean doesn't have her, the earth does. While the world was looking for Lynette, Brian's behavior underwent a dramatic transformation. During initial police questioning, he was described as monotone and strangely void of expression. But once the cameras arrived, the performance began. He pivoted to a hyper-emotional, theatrical persona of a grieving husband. However, when investigators pushed for the tactical details that could actually save her life, what was she wearing over her bikini? Did her glasses have a floating strap? What size was her shoe? He had no answers. He spent the majority of his media time talking about his own exhaustion and his own one job, to protect her, centering himself as the victim of the tragedy rather than the woman who had actually disappeared. Then came the ultimate red flag, the flight. Despite tearfully promising the media that he would never stop searching, and that he would stay until she was found, Brian Hooker did the one thing a grieving, innocent spouse almost never does. He left the country. Just days into the investigation, while divers were still in the water, Brian hopped on a plane back to the United States. He cited a sick mother in California as his reason for leaving, but to investigators, this looked like jurisdictional flight. By crossing back into the U.S., Brian put a massive legal and bureaucratic wall between himself and the Bahamian authorities. He left the soulmate he claimed to love buried, perhaps literally, in a foreign land he had no intention of returning to. This leads to the shallow grave theory. If Brian used those 6 missing hours in the 9-hour void to navigate to one of the hundreds of uninhabited, scrub-filled cays in the area, he could have easily disposed of Lynette and the floating dry bag on land. This would explain the broken oar, used not for rowing, but for digging into the limestone and sand. It explains why the sonar found nothing in the bay and why he chose to row for miles to Marsh Harbor. He wasn't looking for help, he was leading the search party as far away from the actual site as possible. By the time anyone thought to look on the remote islands, the tropical heat and the elements would have done their work. As we stand today, Lynette Hooker remains missing. But in the eyes of the public and the experts analyzing the psychology of this case, the story Brian Hooker told has completely disintegrated. He is back in the States, living his life, while Lynette remains a ghost in the Abacos. The tragedy isn't just that she vanished, it's that the person who was supposed to be her protector may have been the one who ensured she would never be found. Thank you for joining me for this investigation. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications because we will be dropping a deeper dive into this case tomorrow, and we want you to be the first to see it when it drops.